Marcus Holloway had hidden 3 cameras inside his paralyzed son's bedroom, not to spy, but to protect. He told himself it was the right thing to do. He was a father. That was his job. But on the 3rd night, when he finally opened the footage, his coffee went cold and untouched on the table beside him. He watched the screen for 2 hours straight, not moving, not blinking. What the maid had been doing behind that closed door every single day had nothing to do with danger. So why did it break him completely? Columbus, Ohio in late October is a particular kind of gray. The sky hangs low and dull over the brick neighborhoods, the maple trees stripped bare, the sidewalks slick with old rain. It was the kind of city that kept its head down and moved forward, and Marcus Holloway had always fit right into it. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of hands that could read a blueprint as easily as a menu, and he carried himself with the measured quietness of a man who had long ago decided that feeling things too loudly was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was a structural engineer at Denton, and associates good at his job, respected by his team, and home by 7:30. Most nights not because he wanted to be, but because there was no one else. 2 years ago, everything that Marcus Holloway had built his life around came apart on a Tuesday evening on Route 40. A delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection near Henderson Park. The impact was on the passenger side. His wife Diane died 3 days later in the ICU without ever regaining consciousness. Their son Owen, 16 years old, center on the Jefferson High basketball team, a kid who could name every starting lineup in the NBA going back 15 years, woke up in a different body. The spinal cord injury was at the lumbar level, which the doctors explained with charts and gentle voices, and what it meant in plain language was that Owen would never walk again. Marcus had listened to that sentence sitting in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, and he had nodded like it was a quarterly budget update. He didn't cry in front of anyone until he was sitting in his truck in the hospital parking garage at 2 in the morning, and even then, it was brief and silent, like everything else about him. Their house on Birchwood Lane was a 3-bedroom colonial they had bought when Owen was 7. Diane had painted the kitchen yellow. Marcus had never gotten around to repainting it, even though the color now felt like a bruise every time he walked in for his morning coffee. Owen's room was at the end of the hall next to the bathroom, which the occupational therapist had said was the right arrangement. There were handrails on the walls, now a hospital-grade adjustable bed with padded side rails and a motorized wheelchair that cost more than Marcus's first car. The room that had once been papered with Cavaliers posters and smelled of old sneakers was now clean and clinical and quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Marcus passed that closed door every morning on his way to the shower and every night on his way to bed, and most days he stopped and put his hand on the frame for exactly 2 seconds and then kept walking. 3 months ago, Marcus had hired Dorothy Carmichael through an agency called Sunrise Home Care. The agency had given him a folder with her certifications, her references, and a photograph that showed a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a smile that looked like it had been in regular use for a long time. She had taught elementary school for 25 years in the Columbus City Schools District before her husband, Gerald, passed away from a heart attack, and she had shifted into private home care. Her references were solid. Her background check was clean. Marcus had read through the file in 15 minutes over lunch, called the agency back, and said she'd do. She started the following Monday at 8 in the morning. He had been at work by 7:45, so he left her a typed list of Owen's medications, the physical therapy schedule, and the Wi-Fi password on the kitchen counter, and that was the sum total of their introduction. It was a Wednesday in late October when something shifted. Marcus had been in a site review on the east side that wrapped up 2 hours ahead of schedule because the city inspector had a family emergency, and rather than go back to the office, he drove home. He pulled into the driveway at 2:43 in the afternoon, and let himself in through the side door, which opened directly to the kitchen, and the first thing he heard was laughter. Not the television. He knew the sound of the television, the flat, canned rhythms of daytime programming. This was real laughter, low and surprised, the kind that catches a person off guard. He followed it down the hall and stopped outside Owen's door, which was open just enough for the sound to carry through. He pushed it open the rest of the way and stood in the frame. Owen was sitting up at roughly 45 degrees, his good posture, something the PT had been working on, and across his lap was a keyboard tray, the kind that clamps to the bed rail that Marcus had not bought and had not seen before. On the keyboard tray was a wireless keyboard, and angled in front of Owen on an adjustable arm, also new, was an older laptop with a crack along the bottom left corner of the lid. Dorothy Carmichael was sitting in the visitor's chair, pulled close to the bed, and she had a printout on her knee, covered in handwritten notes in red ink. She looked up when Marcus appeared in the doorway, and her expression did not change in the slightest. "You're home early," she said pleasantly, and began collecting her things with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had nothing to hide. Owen said nothing. He just looked at his father for a moment with an expression that was careful and unreadable, and then he turned the laptop screen away. Dorothy left at her usual time. Marcus stood in the kitchen and listened to her boots on the front porch steps and the sound of her Accord starting in the street. He stood there for a while after she was gone. He went down the hall and stood in Owen's doorway again. Owen had his headphones on and was looking at the ceiling. Marcus said dinner would be ready in 40 minutes. Owen nodded without removing the headphones. That night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table after Owen had gone to sleep and turned the situation over in his mind. With the same methodical patience he applied to structural calculations. Something was happening in that room every day while he was at work. Something that neither his son nor the woman he was paying wanted him to know about. He picked up his phone and called Greg Patton, his oldest friend, who had been saying for weeks that Marcus needed to stop running on autopilot and pay attention to his own house. Greg answered on the second ring, and Marcus explained what he had seen. Greg was quiet for a moment and then said, "You need to put cameras in that room, man. You don't know who this woman is." Marcus slept on it for 2 nights. He was not a man who made decisions quickly or carelessly, and the idea of putting cameras in his son's room sat in his chest at an uncomfortable angle. He told himself it wasn't surveillance, it was oversight. He was the parent. The boy was a minor with significant medical needs cared for by a woman Marcus had never had a real conversation with. He was not spying. He was doing his job. On Friday morning before Dorothy arrived, he mounted 3 small wireless cameras, one on the bookshelf between a lacrosse trophy and an old science fair ribbon angled down toward the bed, one tucked behind the TV on the dresser, and one in the upper corner near the window, where the angle caught both the bed and the door. He linked them to an app on his phone, tested the feeds, and left for work. The first 3 days of footage were unremarkable by the standard Marcus had been half expecting. Dorothy arrived each morning with a canvas tote bag and a thermos of coffee, and she worked through Owen's morning routine with a steadiness that was hard not to respect medication. At 8:15, the assisted range of motion exercises that the physical therapist had demonstrated, the twice-daily repositioning that prevented pressure sores, the mid-morning snack, the careful logging of everything in a small spiral notebook she kept in her bag. She talked to Owen while she worked. Marcus couldn't always make out the words through the camera audio, which was thin and directional, but the cadence was even and unhurried, the kind of voice that filled space without demanding anything back. Owen didn't respond much, but he didn't turn away either, which was more than Marcus could say for his own attempts at conversation. He watched the footage each night in the kitchen with a beer he didn't really drink, and felt the particular discomfort of a man who has been looking for a reason to be suspicious and cannot find one. The 4th day changed things. At approximately 10:20 in the morning, after Dorothy had completed Owen's care routine and washed her hands at the hall bathroom sink, she came back into the room, not with the physical therapy band or the medication tray, but with a laptop, the same cracked lid machine Marcus had seen before, and she set it up on the adjustable arm over the bed. She sat in the chair and angled the screen so Owen could see it clearly. Marcus leaned forward in his kitchen chair and turned up the audio on his phone. The laptop screen showed a development environment, a black background with colored text, the kind of interface that software developers used. She said something, and Owen looked at the screen for a long moment, and then she said something else and pointed at a specific section of the code. Owen's hand moved to the keyboard, slowly at first, hunting the keys, and then with more confidence. Dorothy watched, not hovering, just present. She corrected him twice and nodded 3 times, and at one point laughed at something Owen said. Marcus sat in his office on the 14th floor of a building he had helped design, watching his paralyzed son learn to write code, and felt a sensation in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. He watched the footage from the previous weeks in reverse, scrolling back through the archive, with the focused attention he usually reserved for project audits. The pattern was consistent. Every single day without exception after the medical work was done, Dorothy had sat down with Owen and they had worked. But it wasn't always coding. Some days it was the laptop. Yes, she appeared to be teaching him Python, which Marcus recognized from the syntax, and on some days, what looked like basic web development. But on other days, she had a legal pad, and they were talking through something she was writing down in bullet points. And on still other days, Owen himself was writing filling pages in a composition notebook with the focused intensity of someone working against a deadline only they could see. Marcus watched 8 hours of archived footage in the space of 3 evenings, and by the end of it, he had the beginning of an answer and a completely different set of questions. It was the footage from 34 days ago that stopped Marcus cold. He had been scrolling forward chronologically through the archive when the timestamp reached 9:47 in the morning on a Thursday, and he saw Dorothy standing at the small desk in the corner of Owen's room, the desk that had once held Owen's old PlayStation, and now held a lamp and a stack of books, feeding paper into the compact printer Marcus had bought 2 years ago for Owen's school assignments, and hadn't thought about since. She was printing in bulk. Page after page came out, and she arranged them in order, with the same care she used for everything, tapping the edges against the desk to align them, and then she separated the stack into portions and slid each portion into a large manila envelope. Marcus counted. 6 envelopes. She handwrote an address on each one, pressing down with her pen, taking her time. Then she sealed them, placed them in her canvas tote, and went to make Owen's lunch, as if nothing particularly significant had just happened. Marcus paused the footage and opened a new window on his phone. The image was grainy. The camera on the bookshelf was not designed for close text resolution, but he could make out the shape of the address. He zoomed in as far as the image allowed. The city and state were legible before the resolution gave out. New York, NY. He sat back in his chair, and the kitchen felt smaller than usual. His son had written something substantial enough to print in 6 copies. Dorothy Carmichael had addressed those copies to publishing houses in New York City, and neither of them had said a word to him. He thought about the composition notebooks he had seen in the footage, the way Owen had filled those pages, not with the dutiful slowness of a student completing an assignment, but with the velocity of someone who had something urgent to say. He thought about the laughter he had heard in the hallway 3 weeks ago. He thought about the way Owen had turned the laptop screen away from him in the doorway, and he understood now that it had not been embarrassment. It had been protection. His son had built something private and real and alive in that room, and he had been careful to keep it away from the one person who came and went through the front door every day without once stopping to ask what was going on inside. 3 days after he found the footage of the envelopes, Marcus was sitting in a budget meeting on the 12th floor when his cell phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again immediately. He excused himself and stepped into the corridor and answered it. The voice on the other end was composed and professional, a woman who identified herself as Claire Weston, a senior editor at Meridian Press in New York City. She was calling, she said, regarding a manuscript submission from an author identified as O. Holloway. The manuscript was titled, "The Body Stays, the Mind Flies." Her team had read it twice. They were very interested in discussing the possibility of publication and wanted to get in touch with the author directly. Was this the right contact number for O. Holloway? Marcus looked out the corridor window at the Columbus skyline in the flat November light and said yes. He said he would call her back. He capped his pen, put it in his pocket, picked up his laptop bag from under the conference table, told his assistant he had a family situation, and drove home in 23 minutes. Dorothy's car was still in the street when he pulled into the driveway. He went straight down the hall and into Owen's room without knocking, which was something he had not done in months, observing without thought the politeness of a man treating a teenager's closed door with more respect than he'd treated the teenager behind it. Owen looked up from the keyboard tray. He did not look surprised. He looked like someone who had been waiting for a conversation that was running behind schedule. Marcus stood in the doorway and said, "You sent a manuscript to a publishing house." It was not a question, and Owen did not treat it as one. He said yes. Marcus said, "Without telling me." Owen looked at him for a moment, the way he sometimes looked at complicated plays on the basketball court before he could no longer go to basketball courts working out the angles. He said, "You would have talked me out of it." Marcus opened his mouth and closed it because he was not entirely sure the boy was wrong. Dorothy appeared in the doorway behind Marcus. She had her coat on and her canvas tote over her shoulder, and she stood there with the particular patience of someone who has learned that the most useful thing you can do in certain moments is simply remain present. Marcus turned to face her. He was not an angry man. He had learned a long time ago that anger was the least efficient response to most situations, but there was something working through him that he could feel in his jaw and his hands, something that wasn't quite anger, but was built from the same raw material. He asked her why she hadn't told him what was happening. Dorothy looked at him with calm eyes and said, "Because you didn't ask." She said it without accusation, the same even tone she used for everything. And then she said, "I was hired to take care of Owen. That's what I've been doing." Marcus said he hadn't hired her to run a writing workshop behind his back, and Dorothy said quietly, "No, you hired me to keep your son alive. But keeping someone alive and actually seeing them are two different jobs, and only one of them was in the contract." She left after that. Marcus stood in the hallway and listened to the front door close and her car start up on the street. He went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. He didn't drink and stood at the window over the sink, looking out at the backyard at the basketball hoop he had put up when Owen was 9, the net frayed and gray swinging slightly in the November wind. He thought about something Owen had said the day after the accident, still in the ICU tubes and monitors, when Marcus had stood at the foot of the bed and told him that everything was going to be handled, that he would find the best doctors, the best equipment, the best care. Owen had looked at him with those careful eyes and said, "I know you will, Dad." And the way he said it, not with gratitude, not with relief, but with the specific loneliness of someone being efficiently managed, that had been the sound Marcus had filed away behind all the logistics and never taken back out. That night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and navigated to the camera feeds, something he had done every night for 2.5 weeks. But this time, he did not sit with suspicion or the vigilance of oversight. He sat with something else, something quieter and more uncomfortable, and he started the footage from the very beginning, from Dorothy Carmichael's first day in their house. He watched himself leave that morning before she arrived. He watched her let herself in and stand in the entryway for a moment, looking at the house, The yellow kitchen, the row of Owen's old sports trophies. On the shelf in the hall, the framed photograph of Diane at the beach in Cape Hatteras that Marcus had never been able to take down. He watched her walk to Owen's room and knock twice and open the door. On the screen, Owen was facing the wall, and he didn't turn around. Dorothy sat down in the visitor's chair, and after a long moment she said something. Owen didn't respond. She said something else. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and came back with a glass of water and a bottle of his 9 o'clock medications, and put them on the side table and sat back down. She did not leave. She sat there for 40 minutes, while Owen stared at the wall, and she did not fill the silence with nervous chatter or professional cheerfulness. She just stayed. He watched it all the way through every day in sequence one footage file after another. He watched the day Dorothy had brought a book from her tote bag, a paperback with a cracked spine, and begun to read out loud without asking Owen's permission. He watched Owen's left hand, which was lying on top of the blanket, go from open and limp to slowly closed as he listened. He watched the day almost 2 weeks in, when Owen had asked her what happened next in the story, and Dorothy had looked up from the page and said simply, "You tell me. What do you think happens?" He watched the day Owen had first laughed, a short, surprised sound, like something catching before it was ready, and how Dorothy had kept a perfectly straight face for exactly 3 seconds, and then laughed along with him. He watched footage from a night 3 weeks ago. Dorothy was supposed to have left at 6, but the camera showed her still in the chair at 9:47, and Owen was at the keyboard, typing with both hands, moving fast and uninterrupted, while Dorothy sat nearby with her reading glasses on her own notepad on her knee, making notes in red ink without interrupting him. She had stayed 3 extra hours without telling anyone, and without billing for a single one of them. Marcus closed the laptop at 11:43 and sat in the yellow kitchen in the dark. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on Birchwood Lane, and the headlights moved slowly across the ceiling. He had been telling himself for 2 years that he was doing the right things, working the long hours, paying the bills, maintaining the house, keeping Owen's medical care organized and current. He had told himself that was what good fathers did after catastrophic losses, that the doing was the holding. That structure was the same thing as love, when love was too complicated to look at directly. And sitting in that kitchen in the dark, he understood not as a gradual realization, but as something blunt and immediate, that he had been wrong. Not wrong about the bills, or the therapy schedule, or the handrails. Wrong about the closed door. Wrong about walking past it every morning and every night, and filing the discomfort away under, "We'll talk when things settle down," as if things had any intention of settling on their own. Owen had not needed more efficient care. He had needed his father to come inside the room and stay there. He stood up from the table and walked down the hall. He stopped at Owen's door and stood there in the dark hallway and listened. The house was quiet. He could hear Owen's breathing even and slow asleep. His hand rested against the doorframe, and he stood that way for a long time, not as penance, not as a gesture, but because the door suddenly felt like the most honest summary of the past 2 years that anything in his life had managed to produce. He had built his career on the principle that structural integrity required knowing exactly where the load was being carried and who was bearing it. He had apparently never thought to apply that principle at home. In the morning, he decided he was going to knock, and this time, when the door opened, he was going to go in, and he was going to sit down in the chair next to the bed, Dorothy's chair, and he was going to stay there until there was nothing left to say. He did. He knocked at 7 in the morning before Dorothy arrived, and Owen called, "Come in," with the careful neutrality that teenagers use when they are not sure what version of a parent is about to walk through the door. Marcus came in and sat down and put his phone face down on his knee. He said he owed Owen an apology, not for the cameras, although that too, but for the 2 years before the cameras, for the long evenings at the office, and the spreadsheets at the kitchen table, and the way he had approached everything in their life together, like a project, with deliverables and a timeline. Owen sat with his hands in his lap and didn't say anything, but his jaw wasn't set, the way it sometimes was, and that was enough. Marcus pulled out his phone and turned it over, and showed Owen the email from Claire Weston at Meridian Press and said, "I think this is yours." Owen took the phone and read the email twice. When he looked up, his eyes were careful and bright, and he was holding the phone with both hands. When Dorothy arrived at 8, Marcus was in the kitchen, not leaving just there at the table with 2 cups of coffee, which surprised her enough that she stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment before she came in. He told her about the call from Claire Weston. He told her he had watched the footage, all of it from the beginning. Dorothy sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and waited, because she was a woman who knew the difference between a person who was about to apologize and a person who was about to justify themselves, and she was not yet certain which one was sitting across from her. Marcus said, "I watched the night you stayed until almost 10 o'clock. Dorothy said she hoped that was all right. He said, "You weren't on the clock." She said she knew that. He said, "You did something for my son that I should have been doing." He said it the way he said most important things, plainly, without softening it, because there was no softening that didn't also diminish it. Dorothy nodded once, the same nod she used when Owen got something right that he'd been working on for a long time. Marcus slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Dorothy picked it up and unfolded it, and read it a formal letter offering her a continued role in their household, not as a home care aide, but as Owen's academic and creative advisor with a corresponding salary. Full hours and a second set of keys to the house. She read it twice the same way Owen had read the email, and then she looked up and said, "This is more than I was making before." Marcus said he knew that. She said, "I didn't do this for money." He said, "I know that too. That's why I'm paying you more." She looked at him over the top of her reading glasses for a moment, and then she laughed, a genuine full sound that had clearly been held back for a while, and he smiled, which was something the muscles in his face appeared to remember reluctantly, like an old skill, returning with just enough awkwardness to be real. She said she'd think about it over the weekend. He said that was fine. When she got up to go check on Owen, she left her coat on the back of the chair, which was new, and Marcus noticed it. The video call with Claire Weston happened on a Tuesday evening. Owen propped up in the bed with the adjustable arm holding the laptop. Marcus seated in the chair beside him. Dorothy had moved it from its usual spot so Marcus could sit next to his son, and she herself was in the kitchen, pretending to organize a cabinet that did not need organizing. Claire Weston had red hair and the focused energy of someone who read 3 books at once and considered that a slow week. She told Owen that her team had found the manuscript remarkable, not just for its narrative confidence, but for what she called its emotional accuracy, the way it rendered the experience of being physically limited while internally vast without a trace of self-pity or performance. She asked him what had first made him want to write it. Owen thought about this for a moment. He looked at the kitchen doorway, and then he said, "Someone showed me that there was more than one way to take up space in the world." Claire Weston smiled and wrote something down. Marcus looked at his hands in his lap. The Body Stays, the Mind Flies, by O. Holloway, was published by Meridian Press 6 months later. The author photograph on the back cover was taken by Marcus in the backyard on Birchwood Lane on a morning in early April when the maple trees had just come back and the light was doing something generous. Owen was in his chair, turned slightly toward the camera, and he was not smiling for the photograph exactly. He was laughing at something Marcus had said a half-second before the shutter clicked, and Claire Weston had called it the best author photo she'd received all year because it looked like a person caught being themselves rather than a person performing. Being themselves. Dorothy had driven to the bookstore on High Street on publication day and bought 3 copies without telling anyone, which Owen found out about, because the bookstore owner knew their family and mentioned it when Marcus stopped in the following week. The launch event was held at the Thurber House on Jefferson Avenue, a small literary venue that Owen had apparently known about for years, without Marcus ever being aware of it, which he was beginning to accept was simply the condition of being a father, that your child was always more fully formed and further along than you'd manage to notice. Dorothy sat in the second row in a green wool blazer. Marcus sat beside her and did not check his phone once in 90 minutes, which was the first time that it happened anywhere except a hospital waiting room in several years. Owen spoke for 20 minutes, without notes clearly, and without rushing. And when a woman in the audience, a teacher, it turned out, who had driven up from Lancaster with 4 of her students, asked him what advice he'd give to young people going through something that felt unsurvivable. Owen was quiet for a beat, and then he said, "Find the person in the room who stays after everyone else leaves. That person is trying to tell you something." In the car on the way home, Marcus drove, and Dorothy sat in the passenger seat, and Owen was in the back, the folded wheelchair in the trunk. The city passed by outside the windows, lit up and ordinary and exactly itself, the way cities are at 10:30 on a Tuesday, when the events of the evening have wound down and life is in the process of becoming a memory. Nobody talked for a while. Then Owen said from the back seat, "Dad?" Marcus said, "Yeah." Owen said, "You should come in sometime, when I'm working, if you want." Marcus kept his eyes on the road. He said he'd like that. Owen said, "Okay." Dorothy looked out the window at the streetlights going by and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be added, and she had always known the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that was doing important work all on its own. The basketball hoop in the backyard on Birchwood Lane still had its frayed gray net. Marcus had looked at it a dozen times over the winter, considering whether to replace it, and had never quite gotten around to it. In March, he had come home to find that someone had put a new net on it, clean white nylon tied, tight and even. He had gone inside and not asked who. Some things you let arrive without making them explain themselves the same way you let a door open in its own time, and you trust that when it does, you will still be standing there.